Welcome to Blue Collar Reformation. Today we're finishing up our series of 3 videos on the Crusades. So the first one, I basically talked about how modernism is very critical of the Crusades because they hate Christianity really more than they hate anything else. And the second, I went over the Reformed response to the Crusades, especially Luther, but then later the theology of the Reformed churches looking at from today the perspective of how we can think about the Crusades. Some things were good and some things were bad, like the blending of church and state power. That was bad. But at the same time, the question remains, is it a just war? Because in the Reformed tradition, we believe in what's called just war theory that really goes back to Augustine of Carthage. And so what we're going to look at today is the question of how should we think of like wars in the Middle East and basically the rights of people who have lived there for thousands of years, who have become Christians, who've been ousted from their nations, ousted from their homelands, or have to pay tribute to the Muslims, and how there's these constant wars to really understand that. And I recommend to you, there's a couple books that have come out in fairly recent times by a guy named Raymond Ibrahim. In fact, he's on YouTube as well, and he has a lot of information on this. He's really the leader in this field right now. His book that came out a few years ago called Sword and Scimitar is a very readable, very helpful introduction to the subject. But so is his book, The Heroes of the West, which goes over many of the knights and men who fought for the freedom of the Eastern Christian world in the Crusades. Now, what he does is a very sober interpretation of it. He doesn't gloss over the right and wrong. He's coming from an Eastern Orthodox, or actually an Egyptian Orthodox perspective, so slightly different than my interpretation of what's good and what's bad about the Crusades, because like he loves the Hospitaller Knights and the priesthood knights and everything like that, which, I mean, they're interesting and everybody loves them, right? Because they're heroes. But at the same time, like, okay, technically they shouldn't be priests and have the keys of the kingdom at the same time as fighting in war, because the idea is basically saying that the gospel is warfare. But it is warfare in a sense, but in a different sense I'll explain here in a minute. So we have to distinguish. In the context of the Reformation, we're always making distinctions, right? A good doctor of the church always makes good distinctions. So what we're looking at when we see the Crusades is a distinction that wasn't made. So the distinction between the church and state. So the Pope is calling for crusades. He gives indulgences to those who go on crusades. He raises money by selling indulgences. And then also he has command over the kings of the earth. And that's a man in the church who rules over these things. And that's why the reformers called him the great Antichrist of Rome, because he was arrogating to himself the powers of the age of this world and really doing a lot of naughty things with that. So they see it as a power grab. But we need to look at this with a distinction that we get from the Reformation, and that is the distinction of powers between the magistrate and the church. Spiritual powers in the church, and then the temporal physical powers in the magistrate. So what this allows us to do is to look at the Crusades and say, okay, this was good and this was bad. So like papal power grabs, the blending of church and state, seeing it as a holy war, those kinds of things are really technically wrong, right? They're unbiblical. But at the same time, the question is it a just war? The circumstances of the Crusades were that these lands that were overthrown by the Muslims, that were sought to be retaken by the Crusades, reconquered by the Crusades, the aggression came from the Muslims. And that is the missing piece of this entire subject matter, is Islam. Islam was on a conquest rampage through the Middle East and then through North Africa, and now has spread further south in Africa and, of course, to the east further, and is pushing into Europe even today. And we have to recognize the tactics and methods that they are using and see that it is basically violence or tribute, or basically populating until they have a majority and then can become the rulers of an area. And so what we see today is a similar methodology to what was done throughout the Middle Ages since the rise of Islam. And we have to recognize that that is an unjust thing that they have done. And the cry from the East was, who will come and avenge our blood? For the women who were taken into slavery, for the men who had their skin flayed off of their bodies, for the ones who died in fires or beheadings, All of these things resulted in most of the people writing about the Crusades to say that they couldn't even write anymore because the atrocities were so wicked. And they cried out to the West that had not yet been conquered, who will avenge the blood of those who have died? Who will take back our lands? So you have the burning of Alexandria, the sacking of Constantinople, the destruction of the whole eastern part of the Roman Empire by the Muslims. And really, even though it lasted until the 1400s, the reality is that that Christian culture was basically abolished, cast into not exile, but into a dark age by Islam. And so we can look at this and say with just war theory that it is just that war would be waged to take those lands back by their allies in the West. And the two things that go along with just war theory that I've already talked about in former videos is that an imminent physical threat is at hand and all diplomacy has been finally exhausted. And that is the fact. Diplomacy was exhausted. In fact, the lands had been conquered. And what the Crusades sought to do is not imperialism and colonialism, but to take back those lands that were basically lived in for thousands of years previously by the people who lived there that were displaced and then subjugated by Islam. So like Egypt, Antioch, Damascus, the lands of Armenia and Georgia and all those places were Christian lands. Of course, Georgia is still fairly Christian, but the fact is that these lands were conquered eventually by Islam. And what we have to recognize is that that used to be Christian in all of its depth and orthodoxy in the early church. Now, there are things that are objectionable in the early church. I'm sure that we could look at each of those particularly. But the fact is, it looks to me like if you use these two standards of just war and the powers of the civil magistrate, the Crusades were a just cause. The execution of them resulted in embezzlements, papal power, in a confusion of the church and state, the two swords doctrine. These things were all sort of circumstances that came up through the wickedness of man, frankly, in the West. And the fact is that the East was much stronger in its Christianity than the West was. And I don't think anybody would deny that reading history. And the fact is the East was steamrolled, the West continued, and this supported papal power and resulted in all of the troubles that led to the Reformation. So this is the Lord's sovereignty in history. We have to recognize that, but we can still look at it and we can say there's just things that can be done. Not necessarily by the church, but the church in cooperation, because what the church ought to be doing is spiritual warfare. We can pray for the magistrate. We can pray for justice to be done. We can pray for the protection of those who are on a just cause in war. We can, in our worship services, we are doing liturgical warfare. We are fighting against not the powers of flesh and blood, but even against angels and demons and powers and principalities in the heavenly places. That we are doing warfare that is beyond just the physical realm, but warfare in the seeking of salvation of souls, the good of society through the sanctification of people. And this warfare is greater and more powerful than anything on this earth. The whole reason that the peoples in those regions in the first place were Christians is because of this liturgical warfare that took place by the evangelism and by the church planting of the apostles that were sent out from Jerusalem. So we have to recognize that there is cooperation between the church and state for such causes as even just wars, for prayer and for worship and for making good men who would be able to go and fight in such wars because they can do so recognizing that God calls that as a just thing for a just cause. And so if that is your vocation, like if you're in the military here in the United States or in other places where just wars are fought, you can consider and think about this and realize that you have been called to a sacred duty, even though you don't have the keys of the kingdom. This is PBR signing off. Thank you for watching Blue Collar Reformation. We are here to equip you with wisdom of the Word. The aim is to apply the system of doctrine taught in Scripture to every square inch of faith and life. We are on Twitter and Substack for your sake. Links are in the description. Share with your recalcitrant and reprobate friends and family freely. Blue Collar Reformation is a lightweight and mobile outreach platform. Take it in hand and enter the fray. Godspeed.